Bring in Yves Giroux. He's the parliamentary budget officer, of course. The PBO, always putting out reports on where they think we might be headed. And I wanted to get your first blush there, because of course we know what we have been spending, Yves, to get us through the pandemic. Is it that tough of an exercise to try to figure out what the deficit might look like? I believe you've arrived at a number.
Yes, we have arrived at the number, and it's not rocket science. If we can have scientists working on a vaccine to combat COVID-19, I think we can at least give it a good college try to estimate the deficit in the current fiscal year. And not only is it possible to do that, but we understand there's a lot of uncertainty. The Bank of Canada has recognized that, and that's why the bank has published two big scenarios, a very optimistic scenario and a pessimistic scenario. We have provided an estimate of what the deficit could look like in one scenario where the isolation and lockdown measures are gradually lifted throughout the remainder of the calendar year. And we have come up with a number for that. So it is possible to have that type of scenario and an estimate. And if you were the government, if I was the government, for example, the government has access to information that I, as a parliamentary budget officer, don't have access to. So I'm sure it's possible for the government to put up numbers that are reasonable estimates. And of course, nobody would hold them accountable if there's not accuracy to the nearest decimal. Everybody understands it's a very delicate situation, an unprecedented situation. But I think it's way worse to have no information at all from the government than even a rough estimate.
Yves, I want to bring the co-host Catherine Murray into the conversation, but quickly I just want to ask you, I know it would be unprecedented, but would it be strange to see a budget with a few scenarios thrown in there?
It would be strange, for sure. It would not be something that's the usual. It's not the usual budget. But again, what we've been living since March has not been usual, and it's anything but ordinary. So we have extraordinary measures. I think we could have a budget that's off the beaten path, and that's not your traditional budget with 400 pages of government rhetoric about how good it is. It could just be an update, a fiscal or economic update, outlining a couple of possible paths for the economy and government finances. It's something the bank has done. It's something we have done with one scenario, explaining what the consequences of that scenario would be. And it's always possible to do that. Keep in mind that in usual years, in normal times, so to speak, there are always lots of uncertainties. For example, the government that tabled the budget in 2015 or early in 2016 could not have foreseen the election of Donald Trump, but still they tabled the budget. And that changed a lot of things for Canada. So there's always a lot of unknowns in the economy, but it does not prevent governments from tabling budgets.
Yves, it's Catherine Murray. You know, tabling budgets and/or, to your point, just providing some type of economic update. I'm curious, specifically, what numbers, what information do you want to see in this update that you're not privy to right now, that none of us are privy to right now? What with the plans, the stimulus that's been put in place, is key and critical for all of us to be on board with and quite frankly, to respect that this plan is working? What do you want to see?
Well, we want to see the take-up of current programs, but that we already have to a certain extent. What's critical to see in an update or in a budget is the government's plan going forward. So we know what they've done so far. The Prime Minister and various ministers have held almost daily press conferences, and they've explained quite well to Canadians what they are doing right now. What we are missing as a country is a plan going forward. For example, is the government ready and willing to stimulate the economy once the pandemic is over or once the worst is behind us? Or do they believe that if the pandemic is over, I don't know, say by September, that there won't need to be a stimulus package. So that's the kind of information we don't have right now. We know that the Prime Minister and the government are acting on a daily basis, but we don't know what their plan is. And I'm worried that without a budget or a fiscal update, they're just reacting on a daily basis or on a weekly basis without an overall plan to come back to the new normal whenever the pandemic is over. So that is sorely lacking, and that's the sense of direction that we don't have as citizens from the government of this country.
And Yves, just a follow-up question on that. With respect to a plan post-pandemic, and you mentioned the word stimulus, what kind of stimulus would you want to see, as it relates to, I don't know, maybe a made in Canada solution, taking down some of the interprovincial barriers, perhaps helping out the West more? I mean, there are domestic solutions, I would think, and I'd like your thoughts on that. And also with respect to the stimulus, what does that mean for taxes? I mean, obviously, taxes increasing would not be stimulative to the economy, but where does that leave us?
And that's exactly the type of questions that could get answers either through a budget or a fiscal update. What are the government's priorities going forward? One thing that could be worrying is if the government was intended on pouring more money into infrastructure. The government currently has a long-term plan, Investing in Canada plan, the Invest in Canada plan, and we've seen through our various reports at the PBO that the government has consistently been slightly behind in pouring money into infrastructure as per its plan. So it would be worrying if the only stimulus that came from the government was, again, infrastructure spending, because it's proven to be difficult to stimulate the economy, especially over the last few years, through infrastructure. So it's not so much as what I would like to see in terms of stimulus, but what the government plans on doing. My role is not to provide policy recommendations or that you should do this or should not do that, but as a parliamentary budget officer whose mandate involves transparency and providing analysis and information to parliamentarians that is nonpartisan, there's nothing for me and my team to work from because there is no plan from the government at this point, and that's what we need.
Yves, before we let you go, I want to ask you, the Prime Minister was asked today about, in the long term, having to service all this extra debt that we're putting on. And he pointed, of course, we know that rates are low at the moment. When you take a look structurally, what's happening right now as we push it for years and years and years, where does it leave Canada's ability to make good on its debt obligations?
I'm not worried right now. Because the negative fiscal impact of COVID-19 is expected to be temporary. Of course, it's a big deficit. It's a huge deficit, I would say. But thankfully, interest rates are very, very low. So I'm not concerned about Canada's ability to service its growing debt. But I'd be worried in the absence of a plan, or if the plan going forward foresaw deficits as far as the eye can see. So that's why we'll need to have a collective thinking in this country and a collective decision as to how fast we want to return to either a balanced budget or more sustainable small deficits over time so that we are indeed capable of servicing that debt without making too many sacrifices on the fiscal front, be it austerity or tax increases.
Yves, it's always great to get your insights. Thanks for joining us. Yves Giroux is a parliamentary budget officer. Catherine